Kari Lake gutted America's voice into Iran, then sat in front of the Senate and took credit for the broadcasts she nearly killed. Watch this.
Senator Murphy, I think you're next.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lake, I heard you in response to earlier questions take credit for the programming that's going into Iran right now. And that was a little curious, given the fact that one of the early actions you took was to effectively dismantle our programming in Iran. You cut off funding for Farsi-language radio Farda. You put the VOA Persia staff on leave, such that when the bombing campaign began last summer, we had really no ability to be able to send any message into Iran. In fact, you were able to broadcast 75 minutes of content in a 72-hour period at the very moment when it would probably be very important for the United States to be able to broadcast a message there. So I heard you take credit for the current amount of programming in Iran. Was your decision to dismantle Radio Farsi and Radio Farda and the VOA Persia staff a mistake?
Thank you so much for that question, Senator Murphy. I appreciate it. RFE is who runs Radio Fardi. We run VOA Persia, and it is very much alive and well. We had great coverage. We went into surge mode when the attack happened, and we immediately brought in a huge team of folks to cover it. We actually covered the president's speech live with live translation so that the people of Iran could hear
but just
what was
for clarity, I'm not asking you to tell me what is happening now, and I'm asking you, why did you fire or put on leave all of the VOA Persia staff? Why were we in a position where we had to reconstitute all of that? Do you concede that that was a mistake?
I don't think it was a mistake. I think that we were bringing things to statutory minimum, which is what the executive order mandated for us to do. And we had a small staff, but the minute this happened, we immediately surged and brought more people in. They call it breaking news mode, and anybody who works in journalism understands that you have a kind of a homeostasis level, and then when news breaks, you jump in.
So when this crisis passes, you will bring that staff back down to statutory minimums?
No, I think we're always assessing and reassessing and making sure that we're running things smoothly. But I listen to the folks in VOA. I don't run VOA. I work at the agency level, and I listen to the professionals there to what they need. And I think I know there are people here in this room who work at VOA who would tell you that every single thing they have asked for, we have provided.
Well, that's absolutely not true. That staff protested the devastating cuts. It was a mistake to dismantle our information operations in Iran, and your inability to concede that was a mistake suggests that we have not learned lessons, and perhaps when this crisis is gone, we will once again reduce staff there. There was this very specific issue where staff were requesting access to U.S. transmitters in Kuwait that were necessary in order to broadcast into Iran. And you denied them access to use those transmitters, finally giving them access to one frequency when they needed multiple frequencies. You said that it was because the transmitters were down, that they were inoperable. That doesn't seem to be true. It seems, in fact, from all reports that those transmitters were available, and you were simply making a decision to limit the amount of capacity we had to broadcast into Iran. And you seem to have walked back your contentions that those transmitters were down. It seems like you weren't telling the truth. Can you tell us now whether those transmitters were actually inoperable or whether you were actually actively denying the ability for our staff who do this work to transmit information into Iran?
Thank you very much for that question. I appreciate it. First of all, we've given all funding to Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia. Every grantee that Radio Free Europe is the one that operates Radio Farda, rather, and We've given them every single
But
amount.
talk to me about this. This is a very specific issue where there was a major problem because we weren't able to broadcast into Iran because you had denied access to these transmitters. You said it was because they were inoperable. They were not inoperable, correct?
We have had repairs done on them, so it could have been at a time when there were repairs done, but we weren't denying them in a
you were
punitive
definitive.
way.
You said that this was not a decision to deny them access, that they were inoperable. I mean, this committee can find the answer to this question pretty easily. You're always doing repairs on transmitters. Those transmitters were not inoperable, correct?
I will have to look into that. I don't know.
Well, but you stated on the record that they were inoperable, whereas your staff contended that you were denying them access to the transmitters in order to limit the amount of information in Iran.
Radio Farda was doing a product and VOA Persia was doing a product, and we were using the 24 hours we had to put VOA, which is a government-owned entity, out on the airwaves in Iran. And you know, we have 24 hours, only 24 hours in the day. Unfortunately, sometimes I wish we had more, but we chose to put VOA.
I'm well over my time. I think your limitation of our ability to transmit information to Iran was egregious. It's made more egregious by the fact that you were not telling the truth about what was happening behind the scenes to limit our ability to tell an American story in Iran. And I will follow up for the record on this question of whether you were telling the truth about those transmitters being inoperable. Thank you, Mr.
I'm happy to answer any additional questions.
Okay, so let me set this up. Senator Chris Murphy walks in and immediately catches the contradiction. Kari Lake, the woman now running Voice of America, spent her first months in charge dismantling our Farsi language programming into Iran. She cut funding for Radio Farda. She put the VOA Persian staff on leave. So when the bombing campaign started last summer, the United States could broadcast a grand total of 75 minutes of content into Iran over a 72-hour window. 75 minutes. And then she walked in here and tried to take credit for the programming. Watch what happens when Murphy asks her one simple question. Was dismantling it a mistake? Hit subscribe right now because the dodge you're about to see is the whole story. And before we even get to the answer, you need this on the screen because it changes everything. A federal judge found that Kari Lake had been illegally empowered to act as the de facto CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, the body that oversees Voice of America. The court deemed her actions in that role illegitimate, struck down her authority in March, and ordered laid-off journalists back to work. Despite that ruling, the broadcaster remained in disarray, with staff describing an agency hollowed out by mass firings carried out under Lake's direction following the Project 2025 playbook. The turmoil left key services unable to operate at full strength even as global demand for U.S. broadcasting climbed. Let that sink in. A court already ruled she shouldn't have had this power in the first place. So the person testifying about how well it's all going is the same person a judge said was running it illegally. That is not a small detail. That is the entire foundation of everything she says next. Now listen to her answer, because this is the moment. Murphy asks her directly, "Do you concede it was a mistake?" And she says no. She says she was just bringing things down to statutory minimum, what the executive order mandated, and then they surged back when news broke. She literally calls it breaking news mode. Think about that for a second. She's defending the cuts by saying, "Don't worry, we rushed everyone back the minute the bombs were already falling." That is not a defense. That is a confession with a smile on it. And here's the receipt that makes the dodge impossible to ignore. When the United States joined Israel in striking Iran in the summer of 2025, Voice of America's Persian service had already been silenced by Lake's cuts and was not broadcasting. Members of Congress were furious that at the exact moment the U.S. most needed to speak directly to the Iranian people, the channels built to do so had been dismantled. Roughly 75 furloughed employees were scrambled back to work to cover the conflict. But the service could only produce a few hours of content per day, a fraction of its former reach. So let me make the timeline crystal clear. First, she cut it. Then the war started. Then she scrambled to rebuild what she had just torn down. And now she wants credit for the rebuild. That's like setting your own house on fire and asking for a medal because you called the fire department. The surge isn't proof the system worked. It's proof she broke it right before the worst possible moment. But Murphy isn't done. And this next part is where it stops being about budgets and starts being about the truth. He moves to the transmitters in Kuwait, the hardware we actually need to push a signal into Iran. And he tells her plainly, your staff requested access and you denied them. You gave them one frequency when they needed multiple. And your reason on the record was that the transmitters were inoperable. Watch how she handles that, because the story is about to change in real time. Here's exactly what Murphy was holding. According to reporting cited by Senator Richard Blumenthal, Lake blocked requests from Radio Farda to use the U.S. Agency for Global Media's transmitters in Kuwait during mass protests in Iran and the regime's brutal crackdown in early January. The denial gutted the ability to broadcast Farsi-language coverage into the country at a pivotal moment. Senator Murphy pressed Lake on her shifting explanation, noting she had claimed on the record that the transmitters were inoperable, a contention her own staff disputed, saying she was deliberately limiting broadcast capacity into Iran. So there are only two possible stories here. Either the transmitters were broken, or she chose to keep them quiet. And those two stories cannot both be true. That's the trap. And Murphy built it on her own words. And this right here is where the whole thing collapses. Murphy says, you were definitive. You said they were inoperable. And now Lake's answer becomes, well, we have had repairs done. It could have been a time when repairs were happening. Then the line that ends it, I will have to look into that. I don't know. Stop. She doesn't know. She stated it on the record as fact, and now under questioning, she suddenly doesn't know. That answer wasn't vague by accident. When you're telling the truth, you say yes or no. You don't retreat into, I'll get back to you. The story changed because the first story wasn't holding. And this is so much bigger than one tense exchange. Lawmakers warned that dismantling VOA Persian and Radio Farda handed a strategic victory to the Islamic Republic and abandoned Iranians fighting for their human rights. Critics noted these services had long been a national security asset used to counter regime disinformation and to combat state-spread hatred and anti-Semitism. Democrats also pointed to Russia and China expanding their own propaganda to fill the void left by silenced American broadcasts, asking why the U.S. would willingly cede that ground at a moment its adversaries were openly cheering the cuts. So here's the line. Next time someone tells you Kari Lake is fighting for America, ask them why the regimes in Tehran, Moscow, and Beijing were the ones who benefited from her decisions. Murphy didn't need a speech. He put her own words next to the record, and the record won. She wanted the credit, she wanted the talking point. But the moment the question got specific, the only honest thing left to say was, I don't know. Full stop, hit that like button, subscribe if this made you think, and I'll see you in the next one.